tonight's topic will be David and Michal. The reasons I wanted to do that topic, it's just interesting that it's actually somewhat of a coincidence, but it's not the reason I picked this week's topic. But yesterday's parsha was Shmini, and the Haftarah for Shmini is one of the key stories of David and Michal. So the fact is, I thought it's a good topic to discuss. I am going to focus on specifically Michal's response to David's dancing in front of the Aaron when he came to Yerushalayim. That's the key story, and that really was the topic of the Haftarah. That is what I'm going to focus on, and I want to focus on it with the perception of getting into the concept of sniyut and dignity and so forth. The fact is, the story of David and Michal has many aspects to it that are most interesting. David, it touches upon the whole relationship between David and Saul, which is a very difficult relationship to understand. Saul's position, it's very interesting. Saul is continued to be perceived as a righteous person, and he was a righteous person, and all the issues with how he acted and so forth, there seems to be some way that his behavior is almost explained. It's almost like, if you say to a kid, you're not a bad person, but you're a person who does bad things. Well, Saul seems to be like perhaps the most powerful example of someone who is a good person who seems to do bad things, and we're always confused by what was going on with his relationship with David and how he acted that way. There's a few people in Tanakh where we're not willing to define them as evil, even though they do acts which are problematic, and we try to deal with how they acted that way. Saul is perhaps a powerful example of that. It's even hard when you start defining what is evil, because he does certain things, but you don't want to define them as evil. You define them as somehow, mistaken or whatever. But Saul it seems to be jealous of David, and it begins right when David comes back. And but Saul's relationship with David seems to be a sort of like respect, love, but really begrudging and jealous. So he's very happy when David comes back, and he's a hero and so forth like that. And he says, "Well, I want to marry you off to my daughter," right? He's going to give him his eldest daughter first, and then all of a sudden he's upset about that. So he marries his eldest daughter off to someone else, and then his daughter Michal goes up to Saul and says, "I really like this David guy," and therefore Saul says, "Okay, so you can marry him," right? And then this whole issue of him marrying him, where it's a way to set David up, because now that he's in the house and so forth, this is a way he can get at David, and actually he does he sends guards to go and get David and basically try to kill David, and Michal basically tells David, "Listen, you got to get out of the house."
Was it really a setup? Because it seemed like Saul was manic depressive by that time, or he was or became paranoid, so that at the beginning it may have been with an open heart, but then his
right. The fact is that seems to be the way Saul is, and Michal seems to be get caught up in that in the sense that it says in the pasuk that she loved David.
Yeah.
And the fact is that since she loved David, she basically, Saul was happy to arrange the marriage, and then he basically sets it up so that he uses the closeness of Michal to David to basically try and set a trap for David. But Michal doesn't give into it and tells David to escape through a window. Mm-hmm. So she basically saves David, and there's a statement in one of the midrashim that says that Michal loved David more than she loved Saul. She loved her husband more than her father, and that's it. And it seems to be this very strange relationship, because afterwards, so Saul doesn't accept the marriage of Michal to David and marries her off to someone else, and And it's very strange in the sense that the Gemara goes through, and the first we go through, what exactly was the halachic perception here? How could Saul, Michal was...
Were they already married?
Yeah, Michal and David were married. So how could Saul just take Michal and marry her off to someone else? So his whole halachic things were Shaul's best didn't accept the execution of David, and the proportion were a problem, but because you can't just say that Michal and this other individual, Palti, I forget his name for some reason, but anyways, right, Palti ben Laish, I think that's it. But why? How did he? You can't just say they did Nevera because what do you call it? David then goes and takes Michal back, and so there's some portion that say, well, David gave a get, right? Because he was concerned that he was going to be away from Michal, and he could get killed. So he was concerned of her becoming a goodness. He gave Michal a get, and this seems to be in concert with David's whole policy in wars. He had his soldiers give gittin before they went to war. To be, there was a certain time condition again in case of Kohanim. If a person didn't return in a year, the get would become effective and so forth. But that was to prevent the goodness. But the point is that it's so one pair say that maybe David gave a get, and therefore since Michal was divorced, you can marry someone else. But there's a problem with that because you cannot remarry your divorced wife. But and David then comes to Ishbos and said, I want back my wife's, I want Michal back. So therefore it must have been that it was okay. And if Michal and and Palti actually had illicit relations, a woman who has had an affair cannot go back to her husband. So the Mefarshim are bothered by this in the sense that no, you can't say it in Nevera, and you can't say there was a get. So how can you explain where Shaul gives gives Michal to this other man, and then David takes her back, and this whole thing's like that. When Michal goes back to David, her quasi husband is crying as she leaves and so forth. But the thing about it is, the Gemara says that what Palti did is he put a sword in his bed, like over his bed, and said, "This is what happens to anyone who touches each other." Basically, he never touched Michal. So the Gemara says, and it's used as a great example.
What do you mean? How could he not touch Michal? I read that one somewhere, but I guess he said.
The Gemara says, as tempted as Yosef was with Potiphar's wife, right? It's not comparable to Boaz, and how tempted Boaz was when Ruth came in, right? And that's not equal to Palti. Because Palti is like, that's it. In fact, it says Sheker Echein Behevel Hayofi Yishuretz Hashem Yitzhal. The Gemara makes an analysis that it's that Chein, that's like Yosef. That's Chein. Yofi, that's like Boaz. But Isha Yirat Hashem, that aspect of Yirat Hashem, that's Palti ben Yoish. Because the fact is, what he did was living with a woman for X amount of years and basically saying we're not touching. It's like a remarkable thing. Anyways,
because she had been with David.
Because she was David's wife.
Right.
So the version go through this whole.
So then, why did he accept her as a wife if he wouldn't touch her?
That's exactly a good question.
Maybe
I didn't say anyone deal with that. Maybe Saul forced him to marry her. Although he seemed to have some kind of affection for Michal because he took care of her, and he cared for her. But I don't know. It's
really weird.
It's a very strange story. But the fact is that's another story that really tells us this relationship. Then Michal goes back to David, and there's obviously a lot of aspects of that relationship. Now, what I did here is I actually brought in an article from Adin Steinsaltz, Michal, the Princess and the Shepherd, and. You're invited to read the article where he really defines the distinction between the two in the sense that Michal was a patrician, aristocracy, the daughter of the king, and David was a shepherd. The title, the Princess and the Shepherd. David was a shepherd and somewhat crude, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, in the sense that David was really like an everyman. He's like much more emotional and so forth. And Michal seemed to carry herself with the elegance of a Queen Elizabeth. Like very staid and so forth and so forth. And that really finds its expression in what happened in David's response to David's dancing when he brought in the Aaron. But it seems to be that Michal was sort of like attracted to this man of the earth, this David figure, and it seems that David was also very attracted to Michal. There's an interesting question there. Yaakov Enden questions. He says, there's a whole Gemara about Zivig Rishon and Zivig Sheni. Zivig Rishon means your first mate, and Zivig Sheni means your second mate. And most people take that to be temporal. The first person you marry is this, the second person marries that. What usually is understood to be is, the famous medrash that says 40 days before the birth of a child, of a son, the bas kol goes out and says so and so to bas so and so, right? Which implies that relationships are, that souls are created and then they're created together and then they're sort of separated and put in two different bodies, and they're trying to find the lost half of your soul. In fact, the Gemara in Kedushin talks about the reason that men go after women is because it's like the man's trying to find his lost rib or his lost body part or whatever Chava was made from. So it's like, the person who lost something goes chasing, the lost object doesn't go chasing after, the owner. The owner goes chasing after the lost object. Says that's why women chase after men. But the fact is that it's the point being that there's this idea that the romantic idea that it's one soul and we're just trying to find a connection and so forth. So that's considered more to be a Zivig Rishon. And then there's another medrash that says, the whole story of what is God doing with his Tana. He's trying to create Shidduchim. It's more difficult for him to do Shidduchim than to split the Red Sea, because what that means is that's when you don't have the two parts of the one soul, you're trying to take apart from here and apart from there and put them together. That's very, very difficult. That's called the Zivig Sheni. So most people think the first person you marry is your Zivig Rishon, and the second person you marry is your Zivig Sheni, and that's it. So Yaakov says that doesn't make sense, and he says no. There's a concept of one type of relationship, another type of relationship, but it has nothing to do with temporally who you married first. It could be the second person married, and he uses the example of David HaMelech, and he says, look, who was David? Zivig Rishon, Bathsheba, Abigail. Who was it? And how do you tell Zivig Rishon? If you think in terms of sexual attraction, which is one way that you can tell of attraction between people, then David obviously had strong sexual attraction to Bathsheba. But it's stated in the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that there's a reference to a pasuk where one of David's wives is referred to as Eglah, which means the little calf, or the female calf. And he says that's a term of endearment. In other words, there's other cases where a wife is referred to as Eglah. And in this term, it's Eglah Ashes David. She's the only one. The list of David's wives. Actually, it's the list of the sons of David through his various wives, and one of them is the son Eglah Ashes David. So the first thing is it says Ashes David only by Eglah, and Eglah is referred to that. And the Gemara says Eglah, that's Michal, because David really loved Michal. Okay, that he really had very strong affection or love for Michal. So that may be the argument that she should be. Maybe that was his Zivig Rishon. I don't know, but it's an interesting question of how you tell Zivig Rishon, Zivig Sheni. There's actually an interesting thing of Adin Steinsaltz has another article.
Sorry,
but
a question. So then why would Malchut come from Bathsheba as opposed to Michal?
That's a good question. It's a good question. You see, it's interesting because it ties in what I was about to say from Adin Steinsaltz. Adin Steinsaltz says, who was the Zivig Rishon of Yaakov Avinu? Right? Who was Yaakov's who's his other half of the soul?
But half the tribes came from Leah.
So the classic answer is, everyone's basic answer is Rachel. She's a Ikeres Beisa. She's the one he loved at first sight. It seems to be that's the Ikeres Beisa, and so forth. But the Din Shaizel points out two things. Rachel's not buried with Yaakov. Leah's buried with Rachel. Leah's buried with Yaakov. And secondly,
the priests are from Levi. He wasn't Rachel also.
Right, and Malchus is from Leah, right? From Yehuda. In fact, most known Jews now are from Yehuda. So the point is, he argues, well, it seems to imply that Leah might have been the real wife, and that supports the idea that
Well, that's not necessarily Zivug Rishon.
No,
according to your definition.
Right, it might not be. The fact that Leah was the first one to marry, that may not be the fact. The point is it may not be that who your progeny with is necessarily your Zivug Rishon. It may not be the perfect romantic model that we would think.
There's a lot of divorces with kids.
Right, and it might be that.
And the other thing with Malchut is that if Hashem didn't want Shaul to be king, then he probably wouldn't want the Malchut to come from Shaul's daughter. So to come from Shaul's line.
That's an interesting perspective.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah. But the fact is, it gets a little bit more complicated when you get to the Purim story.
Well, with Zivug Rishon and Zivug Sheni, I saw an interesting comment in Haggadah. In Haggadah, where we talk about Arami Oved Avi, and we talk about Lavan Bikesh Lakor Hakol. So all of a sudden, Lavan appears from nowhere, and he is undermining everything. There's no mention before or after. So why is he stuck there?
Right.
And the comment was that actually Yaakov's Zivug Rishon was supposed to be Rachel. He worked for 7 years for Rachel. And Yosef was he treated as his firstborn. He gave him 2 tribes, the honor of 2 tribes as opposed to the others, so a double chelek.
Right.
And so Yosef was supposed to be the firstborn because Rachel was supposed to be his Zivug Rishon.
Right.
But Lavan was the one who switched it around.
Right.
Lavan was the one who distorted fate and made him marry Leah first.
Right.
The other, which made Yaakov's attention to Yosef, made his siblings jealous because he wasn't a natural firstborn. They sold him, and that's how they ended up in Egypt.
Right. That's true. It's interesting, the language of Zivug Rishon and Zivug Sheni there, because if Zivug Rishon is it the first person you marry, or is it a concept that it's something mystical, which means that whoever was the other half of Yaakov's soul was already known beforehand. But
it could be you never find you marry someone and you never really
that's what
you find them too late or
that's
something.
what Yaakov Enden basically says. He says basically, you don't know who will be your Zivug Rishon, Zivug Sheni. A lot of people think in terms of the one who you have kids with or whatever, or the more significant kids, such as your argument in terms of Bathsheba being the Zivug Rishon because the Malchus comes from.
Isn't there another argument that there's one that is more of a match, and then there's actually 8 or there's something like 8 that are possible b'sherts, and that they're like
8.
So it could be. There's one that's a better match, and then there's 8 that are possible.
I didn't hear this number 8 before, but it's possible.
I'm not sure if it's 8, Kabbalistically.
That's where you get into questions of the Zivug Sheni, because God is able to connect these souls because they have something in common. Right.
So does that mean that? So what makes a Zivug Rishon and versus Zivug Sheni? Because so therefore, accomplishing your mission in life is not the same as finding your Zivug Rishon.
No, it seems not that. You see, it starts with one of the strange things is Yehuda and Tamar, right? Yehuda and Tamar have it's from their relations. They have the Malchus comes from Yehuda and Tamar, but a lot of people say that they only had relations once. And then afterwards, Yehuda never stays with Tamar again. So it's an interesting issue that exists to some extent in Jewish thought, where we have a much more romantic perception, like a more holistic perception, as let's say the Rab's statement. The Rab makes a statement, "Ve'ita k'basar echad," with Adam and Chava, it becomes like you should be like one person. So he says this idea is the purpose of sex is not to have kids. It's that sexual relations reflect the unity, or the kid reflects the unity of the parents. So if you take a sort of certain perfected or certain romantic, holistic romantic perception, the child being the product of relations becomes an aspect of this is the joining of the two souls and so forth and so forth, and the product is the creation of a new being. That seems to be a nice holistic way of looking at it, and works very nicely in a monogamous type of situation, and you only have one marriage or whatever. But when you start breaking that down and recognize that you can have children from more than one person, and the person can be married 2 times, 3 times, whatever, and have kids from many different people, and who's to say that the one who is actually the fulfillment of your soul in terms of zivig is actually the one that that should be the essence of your progeny into the future. Who says they go necessarily hand in hand? There seems to be something to this in the sense that Yaakov continued to love Rachel, and in many ways Yosef was distinguished because he was Rachel's son, and in certain ways he felt Rachel was his zivig rishon. But realistically, temporally, the reality is Leah was the first woman that he married, and the first one to give birth. So therefore, that was the challenge of that relationship. But even though Dean Steinzel says, well, the fact that Yehuda comes from Leah may be an argument for why Leah really was the other half of Yaakov's soul, even though Yaakov didn't feel it. But there's other people who say no. He had kids with Leah, but Rachel was still the other half of his soul. And why that's separated, that's just the way God does things.
So does that mean that when we look for the other half of our soul, we may not know what we're looking for? Meaning, that if we think we found our Zivig Rishon, it may not be. Right. I
mean, Yaakov Enden's statement about the Zivig Rishon, I think, is very real in the sense that he says, "Who's David Zivig Rishon?" But if you look at the examples of he's saying, Bathsheba is the classic story of sexual attraction, right? That's basically a strong statement that if you're attracted, there must be some indication of a bonding. But the Gemara specifically says that Michal was the one he loved, the one he really loved.
You can't really say that because so many times you're really attracted to somebody, then as soon as you find out, you talk to them a little, or you find out something about them and you lose it. So the souls really aren't binding,
Right. But with Sheva, I think it was more than that. But then you have the case of Abigail, who was Tzedekis. I mean, there was that whole aspect also. She's like classic Tzedekis. So it's one of the hard things about life. You never know what you're looking for. It's such an interesting.
Therefore, do we only figure out where Zivug Rishon is at the end of our lives retrospectively when we figure out who we've accomplished the most with, or how do we know?
No, because I don't think that's bound to who you accomplish with.
You should find out when you go back up.
Right. Right.
You feel the most connection with.
That's the whole point. I don't know. It's one of the strange things about. There's a romantic side to me that looks at Yaakov and says the fact that Yaakov has such attraction to Rachel reflects the fact that Yaakov was in such a high madriga that he had the feelings of attraction. There also are strong indications that in terms of sexual attraction, where you have concepts, I think, of tzaddikim who have very strong sexual attraction to a specific woman, their wife or the woman they're going to marry, and it's very it's very interesting in the sense that on one level there's a there's sort of prevalent sexual like most people, let's say if they deal with sexuality as in terms of marriage, they sort of think of it in a generic sense. People have a sexual drive, so they have to find an outlet for it, right? So it's like, so almost the attitude is that your spouse is your one permitted what? Outlet. What? So therefore, I mean, obviously, every human being has different attractions or whatever, but it's just basically, you're not thinking like, oh wow, I'm really feeling some attraction. It's like, oh, okay, well, since you have this drive, it's good that your wife is an outlet for it. That seems to be one aspect, right? That's one perspective. But the other perspective, and I think this comes from someone like Yaakov and so forth, is that that my attraction is for specifically this person, and therefore it's not that it's not a generic type of attraction. It's attraction for my other soul, and this is a way I can really, and if I'm really on a level of simkus and really work out, I have that attraction only for this specific person, right? Because the attraction is not generic, but it's very specific to that thing. Now, that's a way of understanding it. Now, but you could have challenges to that argument.
And then you have also, sometimes there's somebody who's always in love with somebody and the other person just never returns.
Right, that's always a classic problem.
Yeah.
But that's why I think from the story of Yaakov and Rachel, that the fact that there was an immediate attraction, to me it's a reflection of the fact that Yaakov was on such a high level that, up until he met Rachel, just never was attracted anyway. There was just no real drive because there was nothing. Once he met Rachel, there was this, because the attraction is not just generic to any person of the opposite sex, but specifically, I'm not being politically correct now, right? But specifically to that person, and I think that also from gives me an idea that my own feeling is that I would like to think of, or I personally lean to the perception that mostly Bathsheba was the Zivig Rishon of David because there was such a strong attraction, and because the Malchut comes from them. There was obviously a very strong importance to that. On the other hand, it seems that Michal was his love, his little calf or whatever. But it's obviously a very interesting discussion. And what I find so interesting about it is that everyone in the world throws around the word love. It's like the dominant, theme out there, and so forth and so forth. And you ask people what is love, and they're sort of like, stymied. Like, what exactly is love? It's not just how do you know who your beshert is, but it's like, how do you know whether your feelings are significant or not?
Well, isn't it shidduch dating all about not going with the sexual attraction and using your head a little more?
It's interesting you say that, or in certain ways, in certain aspects of shidduch dating, it's much more objective sexuality. Okay, it's almost like, well, since this is your only acceptable outlet, I got to make sure that I marry, Miss Universe or whatever, that kind of thing.
Someone you can face for the rest of your life.
Right.
No.
I mean, the truth is that happens to be a problem in the shidduch. That is, shidduch makes it objectified. So once you objectify it, then it's no longer that uniqueness of emotions and the special emotions of attraction. It's almost like, well, I like women that look like this, so therefore I need my shidduch to be like this.
I thought it was more like she should come from this background and
that's part of it. That's part of it.
And the last was she should look like this.
It's all those things. Listen, my daughter went to Stern College, and there was a girl there from Williamsburg, And like she never really found out why she was there, but she was from the Satmar community in Williamsburg, somehow attending Stern College, and it was like a whole hush hush, like my daughter says one time this some other girl from Stern came over to her and said, you know, I ran into someone from Williamsburg and I said that I know you. And this other girl said, what? No. And then she phoned him and said, we have a problem. It seems like, you know, like someone heard. Anyways, it was just an interesting, it was like the story where she was at. And in that world, it was like, this girl, obviously dressed sneistically, you know, but she was dressed impeccably any day of the week. Her hair was never, you know, out of you know, like messed up. I mean, totally. That's what my daughter said. She was dressed perfectly. Why? Because now the truth is, there was a reason she was said. Listen, you're a yid. You represent God in the world. You have to look good. So the fact is how you look at it. But it's a thing in the shidduch world where there's an objectification. So therefore, there is a perception that you have to be attracted to your spouse, and then that's usually defined in much more objective ways. You know, that's just the way it develops.
And then there's a problem again if somebody has gay tendencies.
Right.
How do they find reciprocal?
Yeah. Well, that's another problem. But the fact is, that's a real problem because there's a lot of issues in this regard. But the fact is that it's an area that it's not really dealt with a lot. But it's like there's. See, one of the things that usually precedes about it, I think we perceive this from a shidduch, is the perception almost of this idea of saintliness. But it's much more of a Christian saintliness, and we're going to get to this a little bit tonight, hopefully, in this idea, in the sense that in a Christian saintliness, beneath the surface is supposed to be the same type of being as the behavior. In other words, when you look at a priest, you don't think about the priest as someone who's listening and saying, I'm sexually aroused by everyone, but I don't act upon it. The perception is the priest should also be someone who's not sexually arousable, right? There seems to be an attitude within general Christian perceptions that the drives themselves are problematic. So therefore, I used to say this in the 50s, when you talk about the 50s family values and so forth and so forth, the cheerleaders were still wearing short little skirts, and it was like and that's a big difference when in the Torah perception there's an idea of sneas in terms of how you dress, and the point being, well, like, why are you dressing this way? I mean, you shouldn't be thinking about these things, so it shouldn't matter how I'm dressed. The point is that there's a perception in Torah that there is, that beneath the surface there's not just the reality of human existence, of the human drives, but there's supposed to be human drives, and that's a classic issue from a Torah perspective. The fact is the Rambam deals with this in the Shemona Prakim, and the fact that the Greek perception of ethics was that the person with ethical feelings was a greater ethical person. In other words, there's a person who likes to steal but doesn't steal, and then there's a person who has no interest in stealing. So from the Greek perspective, that's considered the higher person who doesn't have those drives whatsoever. Okay? On the other hand, from the Torah perspective, there are clearly some aspects where you're supposed to have drives, but you stop the drives because God tells you not to. So the Rambam answered that question by defining two different types of mitzvot. He says there's chukim and there's mitzvot sichliot, or mishpatim. The mishpatim, you're supposed to have an ethical concept behind it. In other words, you're not supposed to. Not only are you not supposed to steal, you're not supposed to desire to steal. Both things go in tandem. Okay. On the other hand, says there's other mitzvot such as let's say not eating pork, where you're supposed to actually want to eat pork. You're supposed to go, gee, that Big Mac looks really, really good, but God says I can't eat it. So the point is there's actually a higher level of saying I have that desire, I'm controlling myself, but I have that desire. So the Rambam Master says there's some mitzvot like this and some mitzvot like that. It may be that the reality is even much more complex in the sense that with, let's say, with sexuality, and it's not clear in the Rambam. There's a lot of questions whether sexuality should be in the first category and the second category. There seems to be arguments both ways, But it seems to me that there's supposed to be an aspect of some value in sexual attraction, specifically for your spouse, and you're supposed to be sexually attractive. And on the other hand, maybe not have that sexual attraction to other individuals. But on the other hand, just not to have that sexual attraction whatsoever is totally not looked upon so great either. Which is a difference in that shidduch model, in the sense that if you decide to just pick someone based upon tzitzis and yichus and things like that, but you have absolutely no attraction to them, that may not be a Torah model either. On the other hand, then you get into the issues of the generic attraction and the specific attraction, and that's where you get into a variety of issues of these matters. See, this really leads to, in other words, what I'm really doing is defining a little bit of what's going to be my final point, or where we're going to tonight. That the disagreement between Michal and David came down to that issue, in the sense that you conduct yourself a certain way, but what's below the surface? Okay? In other words, when you behave a certain way, say cold and certain aspect on the outside, well, is that the way you're supposed to feel that as well, or are you supposed to feel something different inside yourself, even though you act a certain way? Let me give you an example. Like Chaim Volozhiner supposedly said something to the extent that on the outside, in terms of your behavior, you have to do the halacha. You can't show any doubt. Outside, the halacha is. But in terms of your own mind and all the questions and doubts that you have, that's in your mind. That's obviously going to be the factor of your mind. That's one of the reasons when people say, I need mami b'emunah shalema, I believe with a perfect faith. That's not the language of the Rambam in his Zikarim. He never says that word. That was the language of a pietist later, someone who wrote the song. But he never said that, because there's one thing to say, I will act a certain way. There's another thing to say, listen, I have to live with the reality of the questioning and so forth and so forth. I may think this is right, I may even have a strong belief that it's right, but I have to be in reality of the questionings and so forth and so forth. But that's internally. So the question is, what is the relationship between you and your external appearance? So there are certain people who, classic story about the guy who's brave. He's brave, and it says, I wish I had, the cold water that runs in your veins. It says, I was scared out of my mind. I just had to do what I had to do. There's one thing about what you feel, and there's another thing about how you act.
The courage of Esther going to the miller.
Right, and the way she conducted herself, and the way she feels internally. And that issue is really very much in connection here. It's really part of that issue of sneas. I pointed out also with Esther. I mean, Esther is considered snoo and so forth and so forth. But when it came time that she had to flirt a little bit to get Achashverosh upset with Haman, she sort of knew how to do it. You know what I mean? So there's that aspect of whether, what's on the outside, and then what's going on inside a person. And what's going on inside a person can be somewhat more involved in feeling much more what's going on in the world.
But I don't see what your point is with Michal.
We're going to get there.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I thought I missed it.
No. I'm going to say that's where we're going to go.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Dean Steinzelt defines it as this distinction between the princess and the scepter, and sort of like Michal was like, he even says that she conducted herself. She was cold and dignified and so forth, and she said this was the right behavior. The one time that David sort of goes wild in front of the Aron, she's saying you can't act like that. That's
it's sort of ignoring everything that's happened up until then. The poor woman who turned her back on her family in order to help her husband, who she loved dearly. He cheats on her. She's given to another man.
What do you mean cheats on her?
On Michal?
Yeah. Are you talking? Well, he's mostly married other women. That was okay. That's not cheating. Okay. They did have polygamy back then. Okay. If you're talking about Bathsheba,
it's probably something she was expecting because that's the way it was those days too.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting issue in terms of it's interesting because the issue with Bathsheba, you can think about the fact that David slept with Bathsheba even before they got married, let's say, or whatever. Okay, or how there's a whole issue of what actually happened between them. But the point was can you define that as cheating? Like, I guess let's put it this way: if a guy has a polygamous marriage,
it's not. But it wasn't a polygamous marriage. He set up the murder of her husband.
Right. Okay. But
so
would the wife be okay? But would the wife be upset? In other words, if a man is married to 6 wives or 8 wives or 12 wives, right, and he has an affair with a 13th woman.
Okay, so
right?
Forget the fact that he
is that cheating? I don't know. I don't know.
That she is completely in love with him.
Right.
She has turned her back on her family.
Right.
She's risked her life to let him escape.
Right.
And she covers up for him. She's given away to Palti. She has no say in the matter. She hasn't. And then, you've got to think this wears on a woman. After a couple of years, it wears on a person.
The key phrase, the key term is the way Michal is. It says Michal Bashol Hayala Yelad Ad Yom Mosa, until her death. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's whole issue in the Gemara where she might have had kids before this event, but she's obviously, Gemara ends up, she's punished for her response to David.
And is she punished by David? Or is she punished by Hashem?
Yeah, David gave her the punishment. Didn't he say that she should never he was so angry at her and he said she shouldn't have more kids?
No.
Oh. No. I have it wrong.
No.
But it doesn't say that Hashem punished her. Maybe David was so angry at her. He said, I'm not going to sleep with you anymore, honey.
I can't see that. I don't get that. I get the fact that because there's actually some enforcement that say Ad Yom Mosa, that she actually had a child because on her day of her death, because she died in childbirth.